9:54 p.m. The basement smelled like old stone and machine oil. It always had. Rosa Ferraro had cleaned that room more times than she could count, dragging her mop across the cold floor, wiping dust from the stone walls, and always stopping for just a moment near the big black safe in the corner. She never touched it. She never even looked at it too long. But she always listened. That was simply the kind of woman Rosa was. She listened to everything. It was the winter of 2009. Rosa was 58 years old. Her hair had gone mostly gray, and her knees hurt on cold mornings, but she still showed up before sunrise every single day. She carried her bucket and her mop up the long driveway of the Greco compound on the edge of Naples, just as she had done every morning since 1998. 11 years. Over 4,000 mornings. She had watched children grow into adults inside those walls. She had heard arguments, celebrations, long silences, and the sound of men making decisions she was never meant to hear. The compound belonged to Don Salvatore Greco. Everyone in Naples knew his name, though most people preferred not to say it out loud. He was a large man with thick gray eyebrows and very still eyes, the kind of eyes that made people feel they were being measured. He had run his family's affairs for 23 years and had never once lost control of a situation. Until now. The safe was the problem. It had been sitting in that basement since the 1940s. A German-built floor safe, matte black, roughly the size of a large chest of drawers, welded directly into the stone floor so it could never be moved. Don Salvatore's father had put it there. His father was the only one who knew the combination. And his father had been shot dead in the summer of 1987, taking the combination with him to his grave. For over 20 years, the safe had simply sat there, sealed, silent, and full of things that Don Salvatore very much wanted. Nobody outside the family knew exactly what was inside. But inside the family, people whispered. They said there were land documents worth more than any building standing on that land. They said there were letters from judges. They said there were names, long lists of names, that gave whoever held them a kind of quiet power that no amount of money could buy. Don Salvatore had waited long enough. He needed those documents. He decided to get them open. The first man he called was Enzo Marchetti. Enzo was 60 years old, well respected in Naples, and had once helped a government agency open a Swiss bank vault that no one else could touch. He arrived at the compound in a good suit, carrying a heavy metal case of tools. He looked at the safe for a long time. He pressed his fingers against its surface. He knocked on it gently with his knuckle the way a doctor knocks on a patient's chest. Then he unpacked his tools and got to work. He worked for 6 hours. He tried a listening device that could pick up the tiny sounds inside the lock mechanism. He tried a drill. He tried a thin rod of graphite pressed against the dial. He tried patience and he tried force. At the end of the 6th hour, he packed his tools back into his case, accepted a thick envelope of cash from Marco, Don Salvatore's nephew, and left without making eye contact with anyone. The safe had not moved. Don Salvatore said nothing. He sat in his study upstairs and smoked his cigarette down to the end and lit another one from the first. Then he made more calls. Over the next 8 weeks, 24 more specialists arrived at the compound. One was a retired engineer from Stuttgart who had spent his career designing safes, a man who, according to his own reputation, knew these machines better than anyone alive, because he had built them. He came with a small team and equipment that had to be brought in through the basement window because it was too large for the door. He worked for 3 days. The safe did not open. Another man had worked for a foreign intelligence service in the 1970s. He said very little about his past and asked for cash in advance. He used a method that involved sound waves and a device that looked like a thick black flashlight. He claimed he could make the lock tell him its own combination. After 2 days of this, he gave back half the cash and left. He did not explain why. A team of 3 young men arrived from Milan. They were acoustics engineers, specialists in sound. They brought an array of sensors that they arranged around the safe in a careful pattern, connected to a laptop computer. They told Don Salvatore, with great confidence, that modern technology made secrets impossible to keep. They worked for 4 days. On the 4th day, One of them quietly told Marco that the safe seemed to be constructed in a way that absorbed sound differently than any other safe they had ever tested. They left before dinner. By the time the 20th expert walked through the compound gates, the kitchen staff had stopped being impressed. By the 23rd, they were placing small bets on how many hours each new arrival would last before giving up. By the 25th, a gray-haired man from Palermo who had apparently opened 300 safes without ever meeting one he could not crack, there was no longer any excitement at all. He lasted 5 hours. He left looking quietly shaken. Through all of this, Rosa cleaned. She swept the hallway outside the basement while the experts worked inside. She refilled their coffee cups without being asked. She emptied ashtrays without interrupting conversations. She heard everything, not because she tried to, but because quiet people who are never spoken to tend to hear a great deal. She heard the engineers argue about the safe's construction. She heard the acoustics team say that the basement's old boiler changed the way sound moved through the room. She heard one expert tell another, in a low, frustrated voice, that it was not just the lock that was the problem, it was the way the whole room seemed to work against them. Rosa thought about that for a moment. Then she picked up her mop and moved on. It was Marco who finally said the thing no one else was willing to say. He was 29 years old, quick-thinking and a little reckless in the way young men sometimes are when they are trying to prove themselves. He had watched all 25 experts come and go. He had managed the payments and the arrangements and the excuses. And one evening in late November, after the last expert had driven away, Marco walked into his uncle's study and stood very still in the doorway. Don Salvatore looked up. "What?" he said. Marco took a breath. "What about Rosa?" he said. The room became very quiet. Don Salvatore put down his glass of water. He looked at his nephew for a long moment with those very still eyes. "The cleaning woman," he said. "Yes," Marco said. He explained, a little awkwardly, because it sounded strange even as he said it, that he had once seen Rosa stop in the middle of sweeping and tilt her head toward the east wing of the compound. She had said, quietly, to no one in particular, that the furnace sounded wrong. It had sounded fine to Marco. But the next morning the furnace had failed completely, flooding the east hallway with cold air. He had never forgotten it. Don Salvatore was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Bring her." Rosa was in the laundry room when two of the Don's men appeared in the doorway. She was folding bed sheets, the large white ones that she always folded in thirds because the closet shelf was not quite wide enough for halves. She looked at the two men. They said the Don wanted to see her downstairs. She nodded, set the sheet down on the table, smoothed her apron, and followed them. She had never been brought to Don Salvatore directly before. In 11 years, she had seen him pass in hallways, had cleaned rooms he had just left, had occasionally heard his voice through a closed door. But she had never stood in front of him. She was not afraid. That surprised her a little. She supposed that after 11 years of cleaning up after people, there was not much left that could frighten her. They went down the stone stairs to the basement. Don Salvatore was standing near the far wall, his hands in his pockets. Marco stood a few steps behind him. The safe was in the corner, its black surface marked with small scratches and scuffs from all the drilling and probing and equipment that had been pressed against it over the past 2 months. Rosa looked at it the way she might look at a difficult stain, simply, directly, without drama. Don Salvatore said, "My nephew thinks you can open it." Rosa said nothing. She walked toward the safe slowly. She crouched down, her knees protesting quietly, as they always did, and she placed her right ear flat against the cold black surface of the door. She closed her eyes. Don Salvatore watched her. Marco watched her. Neither of them spoke. The only sound in the room was the low, steady rhythm of the old boiler in the wall, which had been running in that basement since before any of them were born. Rosa listened. To anyone watching, she appeared to be simply resting her ear against a metal door. But inside her mind, something different was happening. Over 11 years of sweeping that basement floor, she had heard the boiler cycle through its patterns hundreds of times. She knew the way sound moved in that particular room, the way it bounced off the low stone ceiling, the way it traveled through the floor, the way the safe itself seemed to hum faintly when the boiler reached a certain temperature. She had never thought about this consciously. She had simply absorbed it, the way a person absorbs the sound of their own home, without noticing, without trying, until one day it is simply part of them. And now, with her ear pressed to the door, she could hear the lock. Not loudly. Not clearly, the way a voice speaks words. But the way a heartbeat can be heard through a chest wall if you are quiet enough and patient enough and you already know what you are listening for. She could feel the tiny resistance in the dial as she turned it. She could feel the almost invisible difference between a tumbler that had not yet caught and one that had settled into place. She had no training. She had no equipment. She had 11 years of accidental, unintentional listening. She reached up and placed both hands on the dial. She turned it to the left. She felt something shift. She turned it to the right. Another shift. She turned it to the left again, more slowly this time, and then she heard, or felt, it was hard to say which, a sound so small it was barely a sound at all. She pulled the handle. The door of the safe swung open. It moved slowly, heavily, with a deep groaning sound that seemed to fill the entire room. Don Salvatore made a short sound that was not quite a word. Marco put his hand over his mouth. Rosa rocked back on her heels, straightened up as best she could, and pressed one hand against her knee to help herself stand. Then she turned around and looked at the two men behind her. Don Salvatore was staring at the open safe. His face was very difficult to read. He was a man who had faced threats, losses, and pressures that most people would not survive, and he had always faced them with the same still expression. But in that moment, standing in his own basement watching an old woman in a gray apron do what 25 professionals had been unable to do, there was something on his face that he clearly did not know how to arrange. Rosa smoothed her apron again. She waited. Don Salvatore dismissed Marco with a small motion of his hand. Marco left, pulling the basement door gently closed behind him. Then Don Salvatore looked at Rosa. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked her how she had done it, in a careful voice, the voice of a man who was not used to asking questions he did not already know the answer to. Rosa thought about it for a moment. Then she told him. She told him about the boiler and the way sound moved in that room. She told him that she had heard that safe for 11 years and that after a while she simply knew what it sounded like when the pieces inside fell into the right place. She said it plainly, without any pride or drama, the way she might explain how to get a stain out of a wool carpet. Don Salvatore listened. When she finished, he stood quietly for a moment. Then he said, mostly to himself, all those men. All that money. He said nothing else. He reached into the safe and picked up a small wooden box from the top of the stack of documents inside. He walked to the stairs. At the bottom step, he stopped and turned back. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple thing to say. But from this particular man, in this particular basement, it carried a weight that Rosa felt long after he had gone upstairs. The change in Rosa's life after that day was not dramatic. There were no speeches, no grand announcements. But things shifted, the way things in a house shift after a window that has been stuck closed for years is finally opened. Her pay was doubled the following month, without explanation. She was given a small private room at the compound for the mornings when she arrived too early to travel home before starting work. The men who had previously walked past her without looking now moved slightly to the side when she entered a room. Small things. But Rosa noticed them. Marco told the story at every family gathering for years. He always told it the same way, with the same pause before he said the word Rosa, watching the faces of the people around the table to see their reaction. He loved that pause. He loved the moment when they understood what he was about to say. Word eventually traveled beyond the compound, as word in Naples always does. It passed through conversations at cafes, through phone calls between people who knew people, through the particular network of quiet information that runs beneath every city. Some of the 25 experts heard the story. Most of them did not believe it at first. A few made calls to verify. One of them, the man from Palermo, the one who had opened 300 safes without ever meeting one he could not crack, heard the story third-hand one evening while eating dinner alone at a restaurant near the harbor. He set down his fork. He sat very still for a moment. Then he laughed, a long, surprised laugh that made the people at the next table look over. When his laughter settled, he picked up his phone and called the friend who had told him the story. "Of course," he said quietly. "Of course it was someone who listened." The rest of us were all too busy making noise. Don Salvatore Greco passed away peacefully in 2016, at the age of 71. His funeral was attended by many people from many different corners of Naples, politicians, businesspeople, old friends, and longtime rivals who came to pay their respects in the careful, formal way that such men do. The front row of seats was reserved for family. But there was one seat in that front row that was not occupied by a family member. It was occupied by Rosa Ferraro, 65 years old, her gray hair neatly pinned, her hands folded in her lap. Nobody questioned it. Nobody moved her. She sat quietly through the entire service, looking straight ahead, as she had always done. After the service, when people were gathered outside in the cold afternoon air, someone asked Marco why Rosa had been given a front row seat. Marco looked at the person for a moment. Then he smiled, the smile of a man who has told a story so many times that the telling of it still gives him pleasure. Because, he said, she was the only person who ever made him stare. Rosa was still cleaning parts of the compound in 2019, moving a little more slowly, pausing a little more often, but still arriving before sunrise. The basement still had the same boiler. The safe still stood in the corner, but its door was kept open now, resting wide against the stone wall. Rosa no longer needed to stop and listen when she cleaned around it. She knew everything she needed to know. She had always known. Nobody had thought to ask her sooner.